this panel, I think, follows on quite nicely from the one that's just come before. We're going to be trying to peer a little bit further into the future, thinking about how things might look and how the different stakeholders might need to operate together when we're looking at more system-wide contrail management and implementation of that. So I'm joined by people from 3 different airlines and 2 ANSPs, so between them they have a huge amount of knowledge from the flight trials that have already been taking place, and hopefully they'll be able to give us some insight into what things might look like in that future time frame when we're either doing much more widespread trials or potentially looking at completely system-wide contrail avoidance. So I'm joined by Rebecca Grenham from American Airlines, Sean Andrews from NATS, Irene Boyer-Souchet from Air France, Dr. Rüdiger Ermentraut from MUAC and Eurocontrol, and Dr. Devaiah Nalianda from TUI Airlines. So I'm going to ask all of the panelists to just introduce themselves a bit more and tell us a little bit about the work that they've been doing so far and their experiences of flight trials to date, and then we'll get into some questions and we'll take some questions from the floor as well. So Rebecca, if you start with you.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I'm Rebecca Grenham. I am a manager on the sustainability team at American Airlines, and I run our Contrails program. So we're now on our 3rd trial, and I've been involved in all of them, and I'm happy to talk more about what those trials look like, working closely with Alan and Jill and other folks that you've met here. So thanks for having me.
Hi everybody, my name's Sean. So I work for NATS in our CESAR team, and I'm the Contrails lead at NATS. My main focus of work recently has been in the Seconia project, which we heard a little bit about earlier from Brice, and I'm also involved in other groups, like I've supported the Jet Zero Task Force group and other kind of non-CO2 groups across the industry.
Hello, I'm Irene Boyer-Souchet. I'm a sustainability manager at Air France in charge of non-CO2 topic for the past 3 years. At Air France, we've been involved on non-CO2 since 2020, and over the years it led us to participate to several research initiatives, launching also a contrail observation program with Météo France, and most recently in the Seconia research project to launch our first live trial on long-haul transatlantic flights.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Rüdiger Ermentraut. I'm working at Maastricht Upper Area Control Center, which is a Eurocontrol unit. My job is a senior project manager. I'm on Contrail since 2019. We conducted the worldwide first operational large-scale and long-duration trial in 2021. That was a 10-month trial at that time, all of our airspace during nights. And now again with Google. So our first trial was in partnership with the DLR, and our second trial, which is the second world first trial of ATC-led mitigation, we are running that with Google, in partnership with Google, since from June 24 until 2 weeks ago, to March 26.
Hi, I'm Devaiah. I'm from the TUI Airline. I manage the Strategic Decarbonization Program, and I work with Christoph Todd, who was up here just before me. We've been running contrail avoidance flights for the last couple of years. We have done over 615 flights till date. So we have some experience, and we've gained a lot of knowledge along the way. We are also part of the A4 Climate Project, which was presented by Dennis and Christiana. We were also part of Decult, where we did 25 flights amongst the 4 airlines that were participating there. And all along, we've learned a lot. So I'm here to present my experiences and some of the results that we have. Thanks.
Thank you all. So listening to the presentations that we've had so far over the last couple of days, it's been really clear that for the climate benefit, we really are going to need contrail avoidance to be coordinated across multiple airlines. It's not going to be any good if we just have a single aircraft avoiding a contrail, there are others coming along behind. It needs to be a coordinated approach. Does that drive us towards an entirely network-based kind of system of contrail avoidance in the future? Or is there still going to be space for autonomy within different airlines for how they approach their own avoidance strategies or routing? Rebecca, if we come to you first.
Well, I definitely think there's room for further coordination. So in our last trial, what we did notice was that pilots, and I want to thank Christoph and the pilots who were up here earlier because they are a really important part of this whole process, as well as ATC and dispatch, of course. But just speaking of pilots, a lot of them did say that they were not able to fly the Contrails route due to ATC. And so I do think, and there are going to be times where just due to traffic, you're not able to fly the route. But I do think that further coordination can hopefully minimize those to the extent possible.
And Sean, how about from an air traffic control perspective?
Yeah, so some of the work that we've been doing in Project Zirconia, Nat's the validation lead, and there's a lot of other partners involved in that. And we've got partners running fast time simulations, looking at the network effects. So actually, can the network manager support some of this? So there's still a lot of work left to be done to understand that properly. We're not there yet. But we've been running some simulations, so the partners have been running simulations, looking at what happens across the whole network when everybody wants to avoid contrails effectively. Is there some way we can have particular demand capacity balancing to support this? So as well as that, we also really want to understand at NATS what is that complete effect. We've always said that we're here to support the trajectories that the airlines want to fly. But to do that, we can't just look at the individual trajectory on its own. We are looking at the collective. So some of the other work done by one of the partners in the project, DLR, have run some real-time simulations earlier this year. So they use some of the NATS airspace to look at actually what happens when there is airline-led contrail mitigation, but happening at scale. So although we're supporting trials at the moment, they are still individual trials, as we've talked about, where there's not all the flights practicing contrail avoidance. But this real-time simulation was investigating what happens when that's happening more at scale within a particular sector. So there'll be some really interesting results coming out of that we're currently writing up in a report, and we'll be able to share that later on in the year. But we absolutely feel that the coordination is really important. So definitely want to kind of use what the airlines want. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. We don't think that ATC should be just telling everybody what to fly and that's the end of it. It's absolutely a collaboration, but it's really important that we are kind of in it together and sharing that information as much as possible.
Great.
Yeah, clearly we also share those conclusions. We see that it really depends on the region's density, what we can do for the moment, and we are far from understanding all the impact at scale. One thing we know for sure is that as an airline, we will still be held accountable of our climate impact. We have responsibility towards customers, the general public, the regulators, but also our insurers, our bankers. So in the end, if we want at some point to have a non-CO2 target, for example, we will need to be sure that we have the levers at our hands. We cannot rely on others to implement the reduction of non-CO2. So I think that there will be a balance to find between the coordination that can be done by ATC and ensuring that the airlines can be confident in reaching their target and being able to implement the level of contrail avoidance that they need.
But anything further?
Okay. Right. I think it has to be a coordinated effort in the end if we have to get the global benefit out of it. But I also feel, given our experiences, that an airline has to start somewhere. And no one's going to hold your hand. You need to get into it. You need to start learning. It's a steep learning curve. So I think all airlines have to give it a go and start getting their stakeholders into place and trying to understand what the complexities of each airline is. But eventually, it has to be a coordinated effort between the airlines and the ANSPs.
Great.
Yes, I completely agree. The initial initiative must be with the airlines, but in dense European airspace, this must be coordinated and orchestrated. So there is, I believe, at least if we want to target these airspaces, there's no way around involving the network manager operations. This is the only one, at least in Europe, who could possibly orchestrate and really harmonize these different flights and get it to a meaningful solution of a day.
And Rudiger, when you were introducing some of the work that you've been doing, you were talking about it being an ATC-led flight trial, is that correct? So what you're talking about now is a much more airline-led approach. So is there going to be an evolution, do you think, in those roles from the flight trials that we're currently conducting to where we want to get to in the future, where we have more widespread implementation?
We have done both. We have accompanied the airline-initiated contrails mitigation trials, where the order was fly as filed, which, by the way, in our airspace is quite difficult, is not as straightforward as it might sound. Fly as filed is something which is possibly easy in non-dense airspaces, but in our airspace, deviating from the initial trajectory is part of the separation procedures. So it is not as straightforward for us in high-density airspace. So we have done that and we have experimented that. We are, on the other hand, ourselves doing the ATC-initiated trials. And these have, today, I think Dennis has said it is like we are doing this alone, but if the two come together, there is an optimization by the airlines and then a re-optimization possible. And it would have benefits. It would have climate benefits to do it. But it is clear that we see the initiative at the airlines first.
Okay. Is that, for the airlines as well, is that something that you see that there might be an evolution from how we're operating in flight trials to a future system?
Well, just to add on to that point about fly as filed, one thing that we've noticed is that it is really challenging to just stick to the flight plan. And in our trials, we've told the pilots, to the extent that you can, please do so. And they almost never can do it 100% of the time because we all know that things happen. So I do agree that point about, particularly in dense airspace, what does this look like and is it even possible, is going to be very important. And I think that that's something that a single airline can't answer alone. I also want to flag that something we've noticed in our trials is turbulence, and particularly around this time of year and the nighttime contrails from the US to Europe, which we believe are the most warming. And so I think that there's, in addition to traffic, there's other kind of the potential safety issues or things that we should all be aware of that will, certainly need further study, because, as an airline, we have, and for control centers too, we have to prioritize safety. And so none of this gets done if we're not thinking about all the potential challenges.
So it sounds as though, obviously it's a very collaborative process, I think, trying to implement a system-wide sort of contrail avoidance approach. But is there a need for overall governance of this, a sort of an impetus to those airlines who are perhaps a little bit less engaged than you are with, going down this route? Is there going to need to be some kind of overarching body or something? Where should the governance around contrails sit when we get to the point of being able to implement it on a wider scale? Sian?
Yeah, I can start. So I think, yes, it's clear that there is going to be some governance needed. What that looks like exactly, I certainly wouldn't like to say too much on. I think that's clear. At the moment, a lot of what we're doing is trial activity, and trial activity can look quite different to what we want the full concept to be. So our view at NATS is a kind of stepwise process of this happening, in that initially we'd probably be looking at, well, when is it easiest to do? So say domestic airspace or continental airspace, we'd be looking at night times where it's quieter and we know the contrails are warming. Well, what can we do there? Times where it's very, very busy, where you've got kind of rush hour traffic, if you like, we can't do that at the moment. We can't practice contrail avoidance in those situations. And there's the controller workshops we've done over the last few years as part of Seconia have really shown that we've got those two extremes. We're not sure exactly where we meet in the middle. But we're really clear that actually, at the moment, we're not saying that we think it should be ATC-led. As I said earlier, we think a kind of hybrid concept, working with airlines and ATC. But in trial purposes, to see the full-scale implementation, there needs to be an ATC-led element, as is happening in Maastricht. Otherwise, we're just seeing some flights at a time happening. So we're getting some really useful information from those flight trials, but to understand the operational implications and potentially some of the observational outcomes that can be achieved from trial activity, we need to have an ATC element, even if long-term it would be both. So the problem is, without the governance there at the moment, not everybody is ready to act. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So, we're almost trying to put something in place to mock that up in a very easy way, perhaps, because we believe that that's coming in the future. This is something that there's action that's needed upon. We have various regulations or incentives could really support this climate action for the industry, and that doesn't have to be either on airlines or on ANSPs. That can be something collective. So currently, obviously, we have things like Corsia and the emissions trading scheme for CO2. At NATS, we're also incentivized on our environmental efficiency. So we have a metric called 3DI, three-dimensional inefficiency, and that kind of measures how we facilitate flights, both on an individual basis but in general. And we have financial incentives applied to that. We're actually looking to change our metrics going forward. It's not a perfect metric. We want to continue it, but to also expand to a multi-metric approach. And in doing that, although we are not currently working on a particular non-CO2 focus, we are opening up that multi-metric approach so that it can incorporate non-CO2 as well on the ANSP side. And
is that something that you think you'll implement, you know, when we're getting towards that stage of large-scale implementation rather than...
Yeah, so we have reference periods that we have to work towards. So we're currently in NR23, which runs to 2028, and we're working on what 2028 to 2033 looks like. So the NR28 side of things, we're looking for those multi-metric approaches that can incorporate this if necessary.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear. Thank you. On the governance questions, anyone else want to, Iran, are you looking like you had something to say about governance?
No, clearly we have maybe the long-term view that at some point non-CO2 will be considered as important as CO2 in terms of actions. But what will happen in between to arrive to that point, I don't know. I would clearly prefer some voluntary actions from airline, also helped maybe by an incentive scheme, rather than something more constraining. So I really hope that all airlines will try to commit to the topic and prove that the industry can move without being forced to by regulation.
Great, thank you. Anyone?
I'd like to add to that that we definitely need some kind of incentive to start moving. We already operate under very constrained environments. So if we are to actually move under those circumstances, I think it will always help to get incentivized for it. How does that incentive really look? I wouldn't be able to say right now, but we definitely need something to start moving this much quicker.
Okay, and how global does that need to be? Obviously, you know, contrails need to be addressed globally. Is it going to be enough if it's done nationally, regionally, or do we need sort of a comprehensive look at governance and incentives potentially on a global scale?
I think Europe is, sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, I would say it has to start somewhere, and we've often see that Europe can have an effect of triggering other movements elsewhere. So I think we have a good basis to have a European leadership on this topic. We have a good aviation industry and a lot of players, so I hope it will happen that way.
Rebecca, would you say that is a good model to sort of start where we're ready in Europe perhaps and then expand what we're doing globally?
I mean, I can't say, to be honest, because it's not something I really work on directly, but I will say that for any sort of policy, I would love if we do think about incentives, as Devaiah and Iran have mentioned, and maybe move away from this. What I don't want to see is potentially penalties for those that are not able to do it, because I just don't think we're at a point where that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, no, understood. I think it was discussed a little bit in the previous panel. They were asking about what's to stop us from doing contrail avoidance on every aircraft tomorrow. And one of the panelists was talking about the fact that it's less around the system and it's more around the human element and making the case for doing it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, within airlines, when you're trying to make the case to senior management, what sort of evidence are you needing to provide? What sort of tools do you need to have in place to be able to make that case that you need to be participating in both flight trials now and potentially in the future for more widespread implementation?
Well, one thing that I think would be helpful, and this is certainly an area of research that or an area where I think needs further research, is just really understanding the fuel penalty. And I know that Tharan talked about it earlier a bit. Our last trial, we didn't see anything that was very clear in terms of the data. There was a lot of noise in terms of the data, so ideally with more trials, we'll get clearer results there. But I just think it's hard to make a case for doing contrail avoidance when you don't really understand the cost. Now, I do think that there's other kind of arguments. There's leadership potentially. Alan mentioned that, we're hoping to get ahead of policy and to show that we're being proactive. And it did kind of help when we started taking this to our European desks in our dispatch center, because they were familiar with contrails and they'd heard that it was getting discussed here in Europe. So, I think all of that's helpful, but I do think the fuel penalty is really crucial, and without clear data, it's kind of hard. I don't know for TUI and Air France, but I do think it's going to be hard to make a case for doing this without better data on that.
Maybe for us, the first driver to gain senior management confidence, because we managed to have it, and that's a really precious thing, was clearly the significant climate impact and also what went with it, so the risk in terms of reputation or regulation, and the opportunity to reduce further the climate impact of aviation, and possibly at a lower cost than what we see on the CO2 side. So those were really good arguments to catch their interest. And then the participation to flight trials, it also brings a lot of benefits. We see that we have like an early cultural integration of the non-CO2 topic. We are able to participate to the elaboration of the solution, to help design it, and that's very precious. And we are also able to already set the governance in place. So we feel like we are gaining a few more years of advance, maybe possibly a competitive advantage on this topic compared to others. And that's really something that speaks to our senior management. And that allowed us to have a strong support.
Just to add to what she just said, when we were looking at it internally and when we started, the 4 questions that we asked ourselves was, first is, what are the actual operational complexities? The knowledge is growing very quickly. The world is getting more and more convinced that this is a problem that the airlines have to sort it out some way or the other, with the ANSPs, of course. So the first thing was how complex is going to be to integrate it operationally into the airline. So that was the first thing. The second thing is we read a lot of research that comes out of various organizations that says fuel penalty is this much. So the second question that we are always asked is, what's the exact fuel penalty? The third question that we are asked is always, how do you validate your flights? Do you have any specific proof that what you've been doing is really being helpful? So that's something we need to address too. And the fourth is, what tools do we have around us, right? So we have a good flight planning tool from Flight Keys, which has, integrates the whole process for us, which is fantastic, but not many airlines have that. So when we already have a tool, it gets a little more easier to sell the concept internally. So we can try certain things, but we need to learn from it. Mm-hmm. So that's the whole premise of it, that, how do you build the case for it, and you need to go at it in a very structured approach and answer these questions, and it should get a bit easier.
That's great, yeah. It sounds as though, particularly in Air France, it's a very narrative discussion about why you should be participating in these things. But Devaiah, you mentioned about fuel burn, and I know that you've been doing a lot of work in calculating fuel burn and sort of magnitude of that, and there seem to be quite differing views in what we've heard about the importance and the magnitude of the fuel burn penalties potentially for contrail avoidance. How do you estimate the extra fuel that's required, and is it actually large enough to be significant for the airlines, or is it small enough that it's not a major consideration?
Is it large enough is like asking how long is a piece of string, right? So it is significant enough for us to notice, and if it is significant enough for us to notice, we need to address it. Yeah. So that's the airlines' stand always. So how do we establish it? At least we have come to the conclusion that comparing a plan against a plan doesn't make sense, because one plan is flown and one plan is not. So we need to make adjustments to the plan that is not flown, so that we could then correct it and then compare it against real flight data and make sure that the comparison we're making is equitable in some way or the other. So we have developed a process internally. It's a little convoluted right now to explain, but we have developed a process which allows us to look at it at that granularity, and we are quite convinced that the numbers we see out of it is reasonable.
Okay, and is that
Just to add one thing, and Devaiah and I have talked about this kind of on the sidelines, is I didn't appreciate how difficult it is to actually measure the fuel burn associated with contrail avoidance, just because it's hard to tell when an aircraft is up in the air, like, well, did they burn fuel because of contrails or was something else going on? So, you know, to Devaiah's point about comparing plan to plan is great, but that only tells you what you plan to do. So I think it's going to be interesting to kind of see the methods that come from that.
absolutely? I guess it goes back to what they were saying on the previous panel about the pilots are doing a lot more than just
Yep.
avoiding contrails. They're also responding to other
Yep.
other things as well, and trying to model that or evaluate that in the fuel burn is no doubt not an easy thing to do. Just coming back to the ANSPs again, obviously your airspaces that you look at are quite different between NATS and MUAC. What are the big differences in the sort of the challenges and I guess the opportunities as well around contrail avoidance for those two different types of airspaces? Sian, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, okay. So at NATS we've got both our London and Scottish FIRs, which are continental airspace, and then we've got the oceanic airspace. So I think probably the biggest difference is focusing on the ocean. It's a very different operation to the radar-controlled environment that you get over land. And you've basically got flights that are cleared for the whole profile across the ocean at a particular flight level. There can be tactical changes, but it kind of lends itself really well to contrail avoidance in some ways. And also we have the fact that in the North Atlantic, it's actually an area where there's significant contrail warming due to the conditions there. But what we find is, although it's easier in some ways because you've got basically east-west, west-east flights, you haven't got climbing and descending flights, you also don't have that flexibility that you get from a radar environment to actually make some changes in flight levels, so it can be more difficult. But we think the ocean's a real opportunity in the first instance for some contrail avoidance. And one of the things that we're thinking is actually it can be done we're nowhere near 100% or anything, but it can be done on a small scale with what we think is really minimal kind of impact on the operational efficiency. It would be a way we could run it in very much kind of business as usual, using existing processes and procedures. In the continental operation, that might be something you want to talk a bit more about, because that's where we have some more similarities. And it really depends a lot on the time of day, but I'll let you say something more on that.
Thanks, Ron. Maybe I just say where we are. So Maastricht UAC is a very good example for a high-density airspace. We are dealing with the London TMAs, with Brussels, Paris, Frankfurt, Copenhagen, Amsterdam. So, and in the images, by the way, which we have seen at several occasions here at this conference, in this workshop, where you had the darkest spot of whatever was measured, that is Maastricht airspace. And but is it always dense? That is the question also. We have, of course, during the day and also the late afternoon, which is night time. So for contrail warming, we have still very high traffic in the late afternoon until 1 o'clock in the night in Brussels sectors. And that makes it difficult, of course. But the deep night from, let's say, midnight, 1 o'clock until 6 o'clock in the morning is low to moderate traffic and has also different traffic patterns. And so here, of course, contrail prevention is possible and even easily possible, and we do have the capacity. This changes immediately if you shift into the day or the late afternoon. So even we have just last week made a reanalysis, an operational reanalysis, and we have just looked into some flights which were in our Brussels area about midnight, and the situation is impossible. It is just impossible to do contrail mitigation there unless you push lesser aircraft into that airspace. That means delay or not flying. That is not what we want. So it is really difficult to create capacity in our airspace is extremely difficult because we are at our top capacity. It is not an airspace where you can easily say, okay, I just add another air traffic controller into that volume and I increase capacity. No, you cannot easily increase capacity. And that makes it so difficult when we move away into high density traffic patterns, which means if we want to tackle the first part of the night, that is extremely difficult or not feasible or unsafe. Doesn't mean it cannot be done, but it would take lots of effort to do it.
Thank you. And just to sort of pick up on various bits from that, obviously, Sian, over the Atlantic, you use is organised track systems, is that the right words? And that's almost sort of artificially constraining capacity, isn't it? Do you foresee when contrail avoidance is sort of more widespread and you're trying to manage that better, that there might be a sort of, it'll be more compatible with moving away from a sort of track system, or how is there the potential for sort of changing how you operate flights across that region?
So we're actually already considering how we use the organised track structure at the moment. And we experimented during the COVID years of having nil track structure. So when there were a lot less aircraft, it was easier to say, yes, it's effectively free route airspace, fly how you like. Just to clarify now, aircraft are not constrained to use the track structure. They can choose to file on random and fly on random tracks. But the reason we have the track structure is that with the amount of traffic we have over the North Atlantic, you're more likely to get closer to the trajectory that you want to get with a track structure in place. So what we're working on doing is sustainability tracks, which are effectively closer together, so they're taking up a smaller footprint over the ocean and just giving that bit more flexibility. So that's work ongoing outside kind of contrail work. But when we think about contrails, yeah, we'd very much consider actually supporting contrail avoidance on the track structure. At the moment, though, it tends to be set up to kind of 24 hours in advance of where it's being used. So the forecast is not necessarily quite right to be able to manage that, but it's certainly something to think about for the future. And it's something we can investigate in the meantime as to the possibilities of it. But yeah, the random tracks are still possibilities to use as well. The track structure is not used 24/7. We have the eastbound tracks they're produced by Nav Canada. They tend to be used for around 8 hours each, and then we'll have the westbound tracks come in, and they're used for about 8 hours. So we do have a period of time where it's purely random tracks as well. But as the track structures are kind of developing and the traffic grows, there's some really interesting visualizations on our website where you can really see how the traffic crosses the Atlantic. And yeah, go have a look if you like. It's quite good fun to watch.
That's great, thank you. I just wanted to sort of echo back a little bit to what we were talking about governance and this kind of thing. Are there any stakeholders or sort of main players that you think are going to be needed in that conversation around governance and sort of future implementation who aren't currently involved in the flight trials, and perhaps we need to educate sort of other groups? I guess how much are regulators, for example, involved now in the current sort of research and development stage that we're at, and how much are they going to need to be involved in a future more widespread implementation? Anyone got any thoughts on any missing stakeholders from what we're doing at the moment?
I suppose from our point of view, from the work I did on the Jet Zero task force, which Mark presented some of yesterday, so we've seen from that actually the Department for Transport are really keen to see Contrail's work progressing, and they're very supportive of that. We would be interested in the Civil Aviation Authority really having probably increasing their involvement. I think they're following what's going on quite closely, but I guess for future they would perhaps be more involved in what's actually happening in the world of contrails.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I guess we're looking quite far ahead potentially, and we're sort of talking about, I guess, hypotheticals. Just based on your experience and knowledge, where you think we might end up. Is this the right time to be thinking about it? Should we be thinking about sort of future implementation and the potential governance, or is it really too early? Are we still figuring out the feasibility of what we're doing and so on? Rudiger, what's your view on that?
That is very difficult. Actually, when we prepared this conference today, which is today, you asked that question. And at that time, I was still in the trial, and my head was completely absorbed by just finishing that trial. And there was no space in my head to think about future items. But since you asked the question, I was thinking about that. So the question is actually quite simple. Where do we think the system, the overall industry will be in 3 years' time? And it is a simple question and difficult to answer. So where will we be in 3 years' time? I believe from the ATC perspective, it would be nice to get more of the same of what we are doing. The precursors, what we are doing should be duplicated. And it would be so nice to get the network manager into a live trial in 3 years' time. That would be a true achievement, I believe. And that would be a game changer as well.
Great.
So that is my viewpoint. So get the NMOC into the game, try it. That needs possibly a little bit of political pressure, but that would be a nice step.
And I think amongst the airlines you were talking about a preference for incentives and not penalties. I guess that also lends itself to having these conversations early.
Yes, but I would also like to add that we need to get certain systems in place. First is flight planning systems are the one that we use is really good, but we need more flight planning systems like that so that you could roll it out in the industry a little more easier. It's impossible to do it in a piecemeal basis. It just doesn't work from a dispatch perspective, and Alan mentioned that too. The second thing is we need to get our validation strategy straight. If you need people to start believing in this, then we need to make sure that we have our validation strategies really nailed down. And once we start doing this, you'll get more and more people on board, and more and more groups on board. And then it becomes, you get the critical mass to actually move it much quicker. And then I believe it's going to move really fast. But how long is that going to take? I wouldn't be able to say right now.
Great. Okay. Unless anyone wants to add anything else on that, I'm going to see if there are any questions from the audience. I don't know if anybody's got any questions for the panel. Yep, Stuart.
I'm going to ask Charlotte a question I've asked her before. Sort of in the Jet Zero. So what opportunity do we have with the OTS on the North Atlantic to build the tracks Contrail aware?
We definitely have a future opportunity. There's the possibility to potentially schedule the lateral tracks and then finalise the actual flight levels that are going to be used on them later. So if we have some Contrail predictions, but we're not quite so that we know we're in that vicinity, but we're not quite so sure of the actual altitude of them, then that can potentially be tweaked. That's something to look into. So there is the potential, but I don't think we're there just yet for the track structure. I think that's a little way into the future. That's partly dependent on the scientific aspects. But as I said, in the meantime, we're working on making the ocean a more efficient operation anyway, and that kind of ties in with giving more flexibility and more choice, which supports Contrail avoidance in itself.
And if the DFT aren't going to give us our UK-based permanent governance and oversight body for Contrails, can we work collaboratively with our Canadian colleagues and do it that way instead?
We're absolutely very keen to work collaboratively with our Canadian colleagues, and I think Blake's here somewhere today. We've been having some discussions. It's great that NAV Canada are keen on pursuing some kind of Contrail R&D effectively and understanding that better. So effectively, half of the main North Atlantic tracks is controlled by NATS, by Shamwick, the other half by NAV Canada in the Gander airspace, and the tracks go across each of those. So again, it's not just on the track structure, it's for the random tracks as well. But yeah, working together will absolutely provide really good benefits, and it would be great to do more of that. Thanks.
Got a question down at the front, Abby, if you can wend your way. So I just want to make sure that people online can hear the questions that are being asked. That's all.
Hi, I'm Shashank Nigam with Simply Flying. I have a question for the airlines on the panel. We saw fuel burn figures earlier in the day that were supposedly insignificant, 0.14%, 0.22%, whereas the figures for fuel burn here on this panel at least definitely seem significant. In your trials, what are the fuel burn penalties like, and why such a big difference from what we saw from the academics in the morning?
I can start, and maybe the others have more significant figures. On our trial, what we see at the moment is almost 2% additional fuel burn on long-haul flights, but it's on a very small data set at the moment, and it's also on areas that we selected, flights that we selected, where it was quite easy to do. So we don't know yet how to extrapolate that if we do it at scale on other regions also. We know some regions will be more challenging. And we don't know also what will be the impact if we set a target, if we want to reduce by 80%, how much does it cost? Because at some point, some flights will be maybe more costly than others. So whether that is significant or not, I think everyone will have a different perception. For us, the question is more, when will it become, under which condition will it become acceptable by an airline? And I think one of the answers is that if we have also a strong confidence in the climate gains, because we will be extremely challenged even internally if we add this extra fuel burn and we cannot prove the climate benefit. But if we can prove the climate benefit, if we can prove that we do it in a very optimized way, then I think it can become acceptable. And clearly, maybe at a small scale, the extra cost is manageable and the abatement cost seems low, so there are a lot of positive signals to move forward. But this question of impact at scale, it really needs to be answered closely. It's not, for us, fuel is always significant.
From my perspective, we've done medium-range flights, around 3.5 to 4 hours at max. We haven't started long-range flights as yet. We believe that the fuel burn penalty will be higher there in terms of overall magnitude. If you ask us, in these 615 flights, it was around 1.5 to 2% was the max we've seen, was the average we've seen. And that, as she rightly said, is justifiable if we know what we have spent that fuel for and whether we can actually see the value for it. But otherwise, it is still a penalty for us.
So Florian and Tom, you can answer some of these questions on the scientific perspective, but we couldn't really there's too much noise in the data from our last trial in terms of fuel burn. So I think it goes to the point of how challenging it is to actually measure. I do think, though, that one of the things we would like a little bit more clarity on is that the numbers, even though they seem small fleet-wide, on a flight-by-flight basis, they could be still quite high. So if you're a dispatcher or a pilot, you might be saying, well, for this particular flight, that fuel burn is potentially high. I don't have the data right in front of me. And I'll also say, too, that I don't think anybody's saying we're going to burn less fuel by avoiding contrails. I think we're all kind of agree that it's going to be more. It's just a matter of how much more. And so that's just an important thing for us to know because, as Devaiah mentioned, we do think there is a penalty potentially, and ideally it's quite low, but we need to understand how low it is before, we're making bigger decisions.
So there's
sorry, can I just make one additional point? There is a slight twist in what we have also seen. Airlines usually optimize for cost. So you need not necessarily always have a Contrail optimized trajectory that has a lower fuel burn. Okay, it has to be time and fuel cost that is taken into account because the cost index that we fly with. So we have seen that sometimes Contrail avoidance flights can have a slightly lower fuel burn too. So, but these are just some of the flights that we've seen. But we still, it's a very small data set, so we're still working on it.
But that's not on average, that's just for individual flights?
Yes,
okay,
individual flights.
So on average,
No,
it's
not
still,
on
yeah. On average, it's still plus.
It's still higher.
Yeah.
Yes, so there's a sort of slightly related question to that online. We've had in the last couple of panels about fuel penalty versus the sort of CO2e coming from contrail warming. And in order to be able to balance that decision, we need a metric of global warming in some manner to determine what the balance between those is. is that something that you're still waiting from the scientists in the room, I guess, to provide a sort of metric? That do we need to be all agreed on a metric, or is that something that you internally can kind of decide on how you balance those two things?
We are not scientists, so we will not take that decision. So we will go with the consensus of the research community and go with that, what's best for the environment, and the operational decisions come from us.
But it's a gap at the moment for you in your decision making, is it?
Yes,
That metric? Okay.
My colleague Dennis has shown a lovely chart in the morning where they analyze our flights, and you could see the whole spectrum of results that come out of it depending on what metric you see. So it's important for us to finally decide, as a consensus, that this is the metric that is most reasonable for our kind of operations, and we will go with that.
That's great. Thank you. So, sorry, yeah.
Maybe we took a bit a different approach. We had to make to choose a metric because we had a trial and we had to balance and calculate CO2 equivalent. So we chose GWP 100. GWP because in the European legislation it's a choice that has been made, and 100 years because an avoidance that is valid under 100 years is also valid under 20 years. So we felt that in this case we were not taking like any risk, and in the end also what we noticed is that since we acted on like really warming flights, in the end the decision was always to avoid whether we would have chosen 20 years or 100 years, because the climate benefit was so big compared to the extra fuel burn that in the end we could have chosen 20 years, we would have made the same decisions probably. But 100 years felt more safe.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm afraid we're really out of time. I'm sure the panelists will be happy to chat in the next break if anyone has any other questions. I did have one final question. It sounds like it's exactly the same as the final question from the previous panel, but I wanted to come to each of you to see when do you think that we're going to be ready for large-scale contrail avoidance? So I'll start with you, Devaiah.
I want to hear other responses first. I would say 10 years. Yeah. It's going to take some time.
I must say, I believe there will be a binary decision at the moment in time, and if it is positive to do contrail mitigation, then it will be in 10 years.
Yeah, for avoidance at scale, I would say 10 years, but maybe the more tricky question is when we could do like start avoidance maybe on a very small scale under controlled conditions. And for that, I don't have an answer yet, but I hope it will be somewhere in between.
Thank you. Sian?
Yeah, I think I've got an answer along those lines. As an initial step, the kind of easier options, I think we could be doing within 5 years.
Thank you.
I will say 10 years too, but I do think Devaiah had an interesting point earlier, which is that it's probably going to be one of those things that's slow to start, and then once it ramps up, it'll ramp up fairly quickly. So I agree with that.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a really interesting panel. I've really enjoyed listening to you all, and I think we now need to move on to the next one. I think we're very much out of time. So thank you all very much.
So yesterday, my friend Mark told you that preparing for contrail mitigation was a little bit like preparing for a marathon. And as a retired athlete and now fat dad, really, I'm here to tell you that the greatest tool at your disposal in preparing for a race is a GPS watch. So without your watch measuring how fast and how far you're running against your training plan, you've got nothing to go on to compare except for vibes and feels. And I might feel like Mo Farah in training, but that's not going to mean anything on race day when I feel like I'm having a cardiac arrest on mile 2. So today I'm here to introduce Contrail Bench, which is a methodology we've developed to answer a simple question: how good are contrail forecasts? And I hear wildly ranging answers to this particular question, but without a tool like our GPS watch, we're really just giving answers based on vibes. So Contrail Bench is our attempt to provide a quantitative and transparent way to measure forecast performance against observations. So the motivation is fairly clear. We need to measure contrail forecasts against real observations. but it's surprisingly difficult. First, the observations themselves are also imperfect. They vary in confidence, recall, and coverage. And second, the benchmark needs not only to be a theoretical metric, but be operationally useful. So for instance, VO2 max is a fancy theoretical running metric, but the winner of races is not necessarily the athlete with the best VO2 calculation. So for contrail avoidance, we know that predictions of persistent contrail regions need not be perfect point-wise accuracy, but for instance, being off by, say, 100 kilometers horizontally probably has no real effect, but we do need forecasts to be resolved at an accuracy of flight levels to be helpful. Before getting into how Contrail Bench works, let's have a quick reminder of classical detection metrics. So here we have in blue the observations of all contrail regions. And in the black, we have all the forecasts of contrail regions. Now, where the two of these overlap, we have the true positives, or the hits. The observations we didn't forecast, in blue on the left, are the false negatives. These are the missed opportunities to avoid a contrail. And on the right-hand side, in the black, we have the false positives. These are the false alarms that add unnecessary costs to us in avoidance. Now, hit rate is the percentage of the observed contrails that were forecast, whereas conversely, the false alarm rate is the fraction of our forecasts that were effectively false alarms. Now, let's have a quick look about what observations we could put into our blue bucket. And so we categorize contrail observations broadly into 5 different families that we've been hearing a lot about over this workshop. So first we have humidity measurements. These are profiles from radiosondes, on-aircraft water sensors, and hyperspectral IR. We have cameras. These are visible and infrared imagery of clouds from satellites, from ground cameras, potentially from aircraft cameras. Then we have LiDAR and cloud profiling radar on the ground and on satellites. We have heat, what I've broadly labeled heat detectors, but effectively radiometers, bolometers on satellites and on the ground. And finally, we have reanalysis data, which isn't, I suppose, technically an observation. It's really a combination of observations peppered into weather models. Now, each of these observations have strengths and weaknesses that we need to layer together in order to gain a fuller understanding. And I call this the observation lasagna you can see on the right-hand side here. And you can see in this chart the same observations are kind of on a spectrum between very high accuracy with relatively sparse coverage through to perhaps slightly less accurate measurements with very, very rich coverage. And in version 1 of Contrail Bench, we are simply evaluating persistent contrail region forecasts. And for this purpose, 2 of these sets of observation families are useful. Humidity measurements, particularly those from on-aircraft sensors and radiosondes, and cameras, i.e. attributed linear contrail detections. Now, the big challenge is that observations are very good at proving presence, but they're quite poor at proving absence. So, in other words, if an observation detects a contrail region, that's strong evidence that it really exists. But if it doesn't detect one, that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't one. For instance, we have a couple of made-up examples on the right-hand side that you can see. Perhaps in a radiosonde example, the real persistent contrail region was just a few kilometers to one side of the radiosonde ascent location. And in the case of, for instance, linear contrail detection, which I'm not sure you can see the clouds from this screen, but there might just be a cloud in the way that's preventing us from seeing a real contrail that was actually formed, but we just couldn't see it in the observations. And so absence of evidence in contrail observations is not normally evidence of absence. And so this has consequences for our contrail metrics. Confident observations can reliably tell us about the blue area on the left, the contrails we should have forecast, but we didn't. But they're really quite poor at confirming the ones on the right, the false alarms. Effectively, if we forecast a contrail but we don't observe one, we can't be sure whether the forecast was wrong or the observation just missed it. And so the classical false alarm rate becomes unreliable in that context. However, perhaps controversially, I shouldn't actually care, for instance, what my heart rate monitor reads whilst I run. I should actually really care how fast my heart will let me run. And perhaps controversially, I think that we actually don't really care about false alarm rate. What we care about is the consequences of false alarm rate. Why don't we dislike false alarms? Because it adds unnecessary cost, additional CO2, additional fuel burn, additional effort. So in Contrail Bench, we still need a cost penalty to counterbalance the hit rate. And so we introduce a simple proxy for this cost penalty, the proportion of global flight distance that falls within the forecasted contrail region. And as this proportion rises, we know that the false alarm rate effectively must be rising, and the cost of following the forecast becomes higher and eventually unacceptable. And we can get an idea from observations at what level this rate should be, quote unquote. For instance, IATA-RAeS suggests this rate should be about 8%. It's roughly what the persistent contrail formation is within IATA-RAeS. So how does Contrail Bench work in its first version? So first, we build a global grid of quarter-by-quarter degree cells for every hour of 2024 at every flight level from 270 to 440 with a tolerance of plus or minus 250 feet. That's about 150 billion cells, and every forecast we're looking at will then make a prediction of which of these cells predicts a persistent contrail region. We then compare those forecasts with observations. So here's an example of comparison with IATA-RAeS. So for that, we check each observed contrail cell. So we look at IATA-RAeS, we see which of the cells IATA-RAeS thinks formed a contrail, shown with the orange boxes here, and we see whether we predicted a contrail region in those. And so in my made-up example, we had a hit rate of 50%. For Contrail Bench version 1, we're going to use IATA-RAeS GRAN, which is a set of around 30 highly calibrated, high-resolution radiosonde sites, and GOES attributed detections using Google's Contrail Watch. And we operate the hit rate on each of those in a very similar manner. Separately, we then calculate our operational cost proxy, what fraction of global flight distance fell within that forecast. And finally, we try increasing our forecast areas by effectively increasing each area by one cell. And this creates a curve that we can sweep out as a cost-benefit curve between how many contrails we catch, which obviously increases as we increase the areas, versus the cost, i.e. how much flight distance is inside that PCR. But perhaps the easiest way to understand this is just for me to show you some preliminary results for this. So as I say, for Contrail Bench version 1, we're using IATA-RAeS GRAN and Google's Contrail Watch detected on GOES East. For context, this is not a small sample. There's about 100,000 PCR cells over that year that fall within IATA-RAeS and Grenham's data set, and about 3 million cells that fall within Google. So it's very difficult for us to get this by chance. If we look at Contrails.org's deterministic forecast, which is what we've run these results on, you can see that we get about a 60% hit rate on IATA-RAeS and Grenham, and a little bit lower hit rate on GOES, which for reasons I can explain separately, we would expect that one to be a little bit lower. Now, one common bugbear I have is that 50 to 60% to people sometimes sounds like this is random chance, and so what we've helpfully done is plotted on what score you would get if you did just make these forecasts by chance. And so in this instance, if you were to predict, say, 6-7% of the contrail regions by random forecasting, then you would get about 6 or 7% hit rate. So we're doing approximately an order of magnitude better than we would do by just guessing entirely where these regions are. Now, as I said, we can also sweep out this forecast area by increasing the buffer size, and you can see here that we get some quite significant increase in hit rate if we were willing to tolerate some larger horizontal areas. You can see as we cross the IAGOS predicted line, we're now up at 70 to 80% hit rates. Now, finally, in terms of what we're doing with Contrail Bench, this is currently only version 1. In the near term, we plan to integrate more observations, incorporate uncertainty in those observations, and improve the cost metrics so it better represents operational avoidance. At the moment, we're probably over-penalizing, say, additional horizontal area, which probably has a low impact in fuel burn terms. Longer term, we want to move beyond just the kind of persistent contrail or not forecasting to start benchmarking forecasts based on, as well, their warming impact, their contrail lifetime, and coverage. But those are all actually really hard to do, so we're not doing those right now. And eventually, we'd like to make Contrail Bench available as a tool, not just a report, but until it's stable, but we're obviously not going to do that. I'm not a big believer in letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and so our intention is that version 1 Contrail Bench report should be released over the next few weeks, hopefully with forecasts from both contrails.org and from Google. If anyone has observations or forecasts that they'd like to see included in future versions of Contrail Bench, please do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And so to summarize, Contrail Bench provides a practical benchmark for contrail forecasts grounded both in observations and operational realities. And my thanks to Tristan Abbott, who did actually most of the real work on this project, and Zeb and Nick at contrails.org, as well as the Google Contrails project, IAGOS and Grenham for the data for the observations. Of course, all you lovely folk for having me. Thank you very much.